In the bitter cold of the winter of 1942, the German Sixth Army lay trapped in the ruins of Stalingrad. The once proud Wehrmacht, the spearhead of Hitler's grand invasion, found itself encircled by the relentless Red Army. Snow covered the shattered streets, and inside the frozen city, German soldiers scavenged for crumbs and melted ice for water. The great promise of Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, had frozen solid in the Russian steppe. What had begun as a symbol of German dominance was transforming into a monument of logistical disaster. Before the war, the Wehrmacht's reputation had rested on its tactical genius. Its officers were schooled in precision, speed, and shock. Yet at Stalingrad, that brilliance collided with the harsh arithmetic of supply and industry. As Soviet forces tightened the noose, German commanders sent desperate messages to headquarters. They needed fuel, ammunition, food. But the Luftwaffe could not deliver. Hitler had ordered that the Sixth Army be supplied entirely by air, a decision that soon proved catastrophic. In theory, 700 tons of supplies per day were required to sustain the army. In practice, the Luftwaffe could barely deliver 80. The skies over the Volga were filled with Soviet fighters, and German transport planes were shot down by the dozens. Mechanics worked in freezing hangars with bare hands, and pilots flew missions knowing their odds of return were slim. By January 1943, men were eating horse meat and boiling leather straps to survive. Ammunition stocks were almost gone. Oil drums stood empty, and the once-feared panzers stood silent in the snow, useless without fuel. It was here that German officers began to grasp a painful reality. Tactical brilliance meant nothing without industrial depth. The Soviet Union, with its vast territory and endless manpower, could afford losses Germany could not. The Luftwaffe's failure to sustain Stalingrad revealed the limits of German industry. For the first time, whispers spread among officers that Germany's war machine, though sophisticated, was too small for the war it had unleashed. Stalingrad was not merely a battlefield defeat. It was a logistical collapse, a signal that the Third Reich's industrial reach had met its breaking point. In the early months of 1942, while the German armies drove deep into Soviet territory, something extraordinary was unfolding far behind the front lines. Across the endless plains of the Soviet Union, thousands of trains rumbled eastward, loaded with the dismantled skeletons of entire factories. Machine tools, turbines, steel presses, and even half-finished tanks were being evacuated beyond the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe's bombers. It was an exodus unlike anything the modern world had ever seen. Under the direct orders of Joseph Stalin and the State Defense Committee, over 1,500 major industrial plants were uprooted and reassembled in the east. Cities like Magnitogorsk, Sverdlovsk, and Chelyabinsk became the heart of a new Soviet industrial empire. Workers toiled around the clock in bitter cold, building weapons in wooden sheds lit by oil lamps. Many had fled from the West with nothing but the clothes they wore. Women, students, and even children joined the labor force, turning the Soviet hinterlands into a living machine of war production. By late 1942, the results were staggering. The T-34 tank, with its sloped armor and rugged reliability, began rolling off assembly lines faster than ever before. Soviet factories produced thousands each month, outpacing German production several times over. The famous Katyusha rocket launchers, nicknamed Stalin's organs, became symbols of Soviet firepower and industrial resolve. Trains thundered through the night carrying tanks, ammunition, and supplies toward the front. Soviet rail networks, maintained with brutal efficiency, ensured that no sector remained unfed for long. German intelligence officers were bewildered. Reports from the Eastern Front described the Soviet war machine as limitless. Captured documents showed that despite massive territorial losses, Soviet output of tanks, artillery, and aircraft had not diminished but actually increased. The Wehrmacht, still relying on horse-drawn wagons for much of its transport, could not comprehend how the Soviets were sustaining such production. For the first time, German generals began to understand that they were not fighting a backward nation dependent on manpower alone. They were facing an industrial juggernaut, one that could move, adapt, and produce faster than any enemy in history. The Soviet Union had transformed geography into its greatest weapon. The factories beyond the Urals would fuel a war effort that Germany's brilliance and tactics could no longer overcome. The battle for supremacy had shifted from the front lines to the assembly lines. By the winter of 1943, the Red Army was not only surviving but advancing. German soldiers noticed that their opponents seemed better equipped, better fed, and better supplied with every passing month. What they did not yet fully understand was that the Soviet Union's newfound abundance was being fed by a transcontinental artery, the American Lend-Lease program. While German troops froze in their tattered uniforms, convoys of Allied ships braved the icy waters of the Arctic, the Persian Gulf, and the Pacific routes to deliver vital materials to the USSR. These supply lines, stretching from the factories of Detroit to the docks of Murmansk, formed one of the greatest logistical operations in modern history. Through snow, storms, and German U-boat attacks, the United States sent the Soviet Union not only weapons but the means to wage modern war on an industrial scale. Tens of thousands of Studebaker US-6 trucks rolled off American assembly lines and became the backbone of Soviet logistics. These vehicles carried artillery, troops, and supplies through the muddy roads of the Eastern Front, replacing horse-drawn wagons and giving the Red Army the mobility it had previously lacked. American locomotives powered Soviet railways. Thousands of tons of aviation fuel, copper, aluminum, and steel crossed oceans to reach Soviet factories. The food shipments alone were monumental. Crates of Spam, corned beef, and powdered eggs sustained millions of soldiers. When German troops overran captured Soviet supply depots, they were astonished to find American goods everywhere, canned meat labeled in English, chocolate bars, and winter coats made in New York or Chicago. To the German officer corps, it was a shocking revelation. They realized that Germany was no longer facing a single enemy, but an industrial alliance that spanned the world. Lend-Lease did not just provide equipment. It freed Soviet factories from the burden of producing trucks, radios, and rations, allowing them to focus on tanks, aircraft, and artillery. This cooperation turned the Soviet war effort into an unstoppable force. As the Red Army grew stronger, the Wehrmacht's shortages became more desperate. Fuel stocks dwindled, ammunition rations tightened, and the promise of resupply from the West evaporated. For the men trapped on the Eastern Front, the difference was clear. The Soviets were growing stronger with every mile advanced, while German forces were fighting a war of attrition they could not win. The Lend-Lease lifeline had quietly tipped the scales of industrial warfare. In the summer of 1943, the fields near Kursk erupted into one of the largest battles in human history. Thousands of tanks clashed across the vast steppe, engines roaring and guns blazing. The Wehrmacht had staked everything on Operation Citadel, its last great offensive in the east. Germany's engineers had produced formidable weapons, the Tiger and Panther tanks, designed to reclaim the initiative. But as the battle raged, it became clear that the war had entered a new age, one where industrial might and logistics would triumph over engineering perfection. The Tigers were terrifying machines, nearly invincible in one-on-one combat. Yet they broke down frequently and consumed enormous amounts of fuel that Germany could no longer supply in sufficient quantities. Soviet forces, by contrast, fielded thousands of T-34s, simpler, faster, easier to repair, and built in staggering numbers by the factories beyond the Urals. For every German tank destroyed, the Soviets seemed to roll out to more. The Red Army's supply columns, powered by Lend-Lease trucks and an endless flow of rail shipments, ensured that ammunition, food, and fuel never ran dry. German commanders on the front began sending grim reports. They described how Soviet divisions appeared tireless, always advancing, always replenished. In contrast, the Wehrmacht's mechanized units stalled for lack of spare parts and fuel. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, struggled to provide air cover as aircraft losses exceeded production. The industrial balance of power had decisively shifted. Even Adolf Hitler, Once convinced that willpower could overcome material odds, began to realize that Germany's war machine was bleeding out. By 1944, as the Red Army surged westward, German cities lay in ruins from Allied bombing campaigns. Factories that once produced weapons now smoldered under the wreckage. Rail lines were shattered, oil fields lost, and the Wehrmacht's logistical chain had collapsed entirely. The Soviet war machine, fed by American supplies and Soviet endurance, rolled inexorably toward Berlin. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the truth was undeniable. The Wehrmacht had been tactically brilliant, but strategically doomed. Its failure lay not in courage or training, but in arithmetic, in the balance of steel, oil, and industry. The moment German officers saw Soviet factories reborn beyond the Urals and American trucks carrying Soviet artillery across the steppe, they knew the outcome. The war was not lost in a single battle, it was lost in the foundries, in the rail yards, and in the supply lines that Germany could never match.